Welcome to everybody. This is our session on Schoolhouse Rock 2.0. We're going to be going over the legislative branch more broadly and kind of the roles and responsibility of some of the offices, staff, and kind of what you would be doing as an intern on a day-to-day basis. All right, so quick, just getting it out of the way. I'm not Taylor Swift the singer, unfortunately. Sorry to burst everyone's bubble. I can't really sing any of her songs. Wish I had her bank account though. So, all right, let's get into it. So the legislative branch at a glance. A lot of people, when they think of the legislative branch, they kind of just think of both the House and Senate inside Congress. But actually, there is an entire ecosystem that Nan will get into shortly that really goes to show that it's so much more than just the two chambers. So obviously, the Article 1 in the Constitution created the legislative branch to consist of the House and the Senate to form the United States Congress. But there are so many other support offices and agencies inside the legislative branch that help it run. So some of these offices include the Architect of the Capitol, the Congressional Budget Office, the Congressional Research Service, the Office of the Clerk, the Government Accountability Office, the CAO, which is the Chief Administration Officer, the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights, the Senate and House Sergeant at Arms, and the United States Capitol Police. And all of these offices and agencies provide support, whether it's legislative support, whether it's security support, whether it's policy, expertise like the Congressional Research Service. All of these pieces work together to help the institution run. And if you want to go to the next slide. Great. So I'm going to give a really quick overview of kind of how Congress is funded and how there is this giant misconception out there of kind of how the legislative branch more broadly actually gets a lot of the money. So if we look every single fiscal year, total government spending is around $5 trillion, which is a lot of money, of course. But when we look at the differences between mandatory and discretionary spending, the results actually get pretty glaring. So mandatory spending includes entitlement programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and it pays interest on the federal debt. But that accounts for roughly 2/3 of all of the spending. But that $1.5 trillion you see here, that's discretionary spending. And that only occurs when Congress acts on it every single year, and it provides those fundings through what are called Appropriations Bills. Now, there are 12 subcommittees in the Appropriations Committee so that each one of those bills goes through. And the one that we're going to be focusing on right now is actually that really, really tiny one down there. That's the legislative branch bill. So that's actually only roughly $4 billion to $5 billion each year. So roughly 0.3% of the entire discretionary funds for how Congress is funded goes to the legislative branch. So of the $5 trillion that we spend every single year, roughly 4 to 5 billion goes to fund the actual institution. So that is staff pay, that's infrastructure, that's Capitol Police security, that's for all of the support agencies and offices. And if you think about it, that number is extremely, extremely small. And Franz can allude to this a little later, but that number is astronomically small compared to the executive branch, which when we think of the balance of powers and checks and balances throughout government, people tend to think that all of the chamber or all of the branches are somewhat equal, but that's actually really not the case. So we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So mention the funding. Now let's kind of look and take a deeper level into kind of the legislative branch employees. So there are over 30,000 congressional staffers within the legislative branch, and roughly about 12.5 thousand of those are employees that work directly for members. So in their personal offices and committee staffs to help all of the legislative operations and constituent services run. In total, there are 23 House committees with 104 subcommittees in the House, and then in the Senate, there are 17 committees and 70 subcommittees. And all of these employees help push those processes forward. And then the remaining A number of those employees make up all of those legislative branch agencies that we were talking about earlier, such as the Congressional Research Service, the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights. It really, really takes everyone to help make the legislative branch function. So you can go forward, Ann. And like we mentioned, there are various types of these offices, and it's people tend to think that it's just the member of Congresses and just the committees, but we also have tons of leadership and caucus offices to help push policies forward or have people put things on the House floor or the Senate floor. And then nonpartisan entities like we talked about with the Congressional Research Service or the Congressional Budget Office. The CRS sole purpose is to help provide resources available to staffers for legislative insights and analyses and briefings, and as well as courses. So if you're an intern interning on the Hill, you can actually take CRS courses to help you get more accustomed to that kind of work. The same can be said with the Congressional Staff Academy as well, so that you can kind of gain more skills to become a better intern or a staffer. And then we also have offices like the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights. So all of these offices together provide that ecosystem that now I'm going to transition to Nan so that she can kind of give a better overview of that lawmaking oversight balance.
Thanks so much, Taylor. So I too, this is very important, I too am not related to Taylor Swift, the singer, or in this case, Taylor Swift, the policy advisor for Demand Progress. Just so we're clear. I'm very sorry if that is why you took this seminar and you're like, look at all Swifts. By way of a preface, I'm going to go very fast. We have a short amount of time, a lot to cover, and we want to get to your questions and discussion, but I've left a lot of information in that I'm not going to dig into because I hope that you'll take the time to explore these slides at home, to read these, and you'll understand where I'm going. And you also all know how to read, which is an important part of being a Hill intern. So I will let you do that on your own time. So clearly Congress has a lot to do and it's growing all the time. Please go ahead, Ann. And this is not your founding fathers Congress. It is so much bigger than it was back then. What I think is most interesting is that in 1789, there were 3 federal agencies, and today in 2022, we literally have no idea. It's a big problem. It's an issue that some of us, like myself, work on in our other capacities, trying to get a handle on that, just like make a list, but we don't even know. Please go ahead, Ann. And here we are, as Taylor mentioned, it's the legislative branch is supposed to provide a counterweight. So not only is there like no money, but we have to go up against these major big agencies and offices of the president, and he has the OMB, National Security Council, all like just a raft of advisors. So Congress needs access to the same kind of information and expertise, which is where a lot of these extra legislative bodies and resources come in. Yes, as we said, there's a whole ecosystem, and it covers all parts of the policymaking progress, from physical buildings to scorekeepers, so we know what a bill costs. And over time, you can see as the executive branch grew, for instance, really big jump in the 30s and 40s in response, Congress has added additional resources for themselves at that time. But before we go ahead, there's 2 important things that I want you to understand from my part of this presentation, because we've gone so very, very quickly. One, as Taylor already said, there's so much more to Congress than meets the eye. And as interns, it's essential and fun that you take advantage of all of that. For instance, until I worked on the Hill, I didn't know that like you can just ask the Library of Congress for anything and they'll send it to you. It can be a book to read over the weekend or a report. Um, so it's smart to use those things while you have access to them. And if you get to use them well, they'll make your job easier as you go along. So it's smart to do that. And second, very important takeaway, the legislative process is nothing like you learned in civics. And you'll get to see that firsthand. This is not Schoolhouse Rock. This is not a bill sitting on the steps of Congress, just waiting to pass and bouncing back and forth. There's so much more going on. And the congressional support system is a big part of that at so many different steps along the way. And if you can really grasp those two things, if you become someone who understands this ecosystem and who understands what really happens when a bill becomes a law and how to use the rules, then you will be so effective and marketable as your career moves forward. So this is just a brief overview, and I'm not going to go into this slide, but you should use this slide because there's a key on the next slide that shows you how these are related to each other in terms of their role by color. And some of the bubbles, if you are comparing the text, their name will have a different color, and that shows where their roles overlap. And the next slide. And here is a poorly made timeline by yours truly of the legislative life cycle. Again, the one that we're kind of familiar with, but it is there to demonstrate where key parts of the ecosystem come in and are involved with the process. The ones that you should really familiarize yourself with very quickly are CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. That is where you will learn how much does something cost, which has everything to do with whether it's going to pass and where it's going to go and what people are going to say about it. The Congressional Research Service, which if you are asked to look something up, chances are there's already a report on it, and CRS has already done it. They do excellent work, so they should always be one of your first places to look. Of course, congress.gov to find your bills, to see who the latest sponsors are and all that. And finally, my favorite, the Government Accountability Office. If you need ideas or you're wondering about, maybe formulating a question for someone for a hearing, GAO does great investigative research into so many different nooks and crannies of the executive branch, and you'll be able to find all kinds of good things there. Especially, they track what Congress has not addressed. When they've pointed out a problem and it hasn't been solved yet, you can go straight to the list and say, we should do one of these. Next slide. And finally, as you'll see it up close and personal, that this is not what you think it is. Nothing is real. As you've probably heard, there's this thing called budget reconciliation, which apparently has nothing to do with actually balancing the budget, which is what I think it should do. It's about jamming something through really fast and overcoming Senate rules. There's special rules in the Senate to get something directly to the floor and skip the committee process. In the House, there are suspensions where, again, they change the voting rules to consider something extra fast. The Rules Committee can just say something has passed, even though it hasn't, or say that if this bill passes, then it means this bill also passed, but secretly. And finally, days and time have no meaning. A day can be many days long. 72 hours to read a bill can actually be 5. It's whatever the Rules Committee says it is. And that's just the beginning, not to mention the interpersonal wrangling, the deal making, responding to the media cycle, and all those other things that are involved. And I bring this up because often if you're working for one chamber, you might not understand that what is happening in the other chamber. I've seen this happen even with very seasoned staff who've been a long time, especially on the Senate. All of a sudden they'll be like, "Man, what is a suspension?" I'm like, "Oh my word, it's been there. You've been there forever. How can you not know this?" But understanding the rules of both chambers will also help you understand the legislative process as a whole, and again, make you more effective as both an intern and for your future career in DC in whatever capacity that may be. And with that, I think I'm done.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Taylor and Nan, for your explanations of the framework of how the legislative branch works and a lot of the different aspects of which makes it challenging, but also a very fun place to work. What I thought I would do with my portion of the presentation is kind of give you some scenarios that you might see behind the scenes in the office that you work in. This is a sense of some of the everyday aspects that an office goes through. These are very much real of what the types of things that members and in some cases committees are thinking about as they're working through the policy process in a political atmosphere. What I want to do is not go into the details of this, but just kind of give you the sense of like one aspect, and we'll go a little bit quicker through some of the others, which is that in many cases, like for example, a member of Congress or a group of members of Congress might write a federal official or some other person, and that gets sent out to them, representing what they want to find out about or asking questions or making their points. So this is, on the right side is an example of a typical type letter from Congress. But as they're going through that process, there's some key questions that need to be asked. There's the process to go through in determining how the letter gets organized and crafted and finalized. And then there's the actual implementation of it. Who's going to write it? Who has to clear it? How are signatures done? And then how does it get sent? Oftentimes there could be media that is associated with that to try to publicize that letter as well. So this is just one example. This is another example. If a member of Congress attends a hearing, and members serve on various committees, depending on whether they serve in the House or the Senate. These are the types of things that go into members' preparation for attending a hearing. And sometimes you might be serving on a committee, and you could see the process of what goes on behind the scenes in preparation for a hearing. So again, a couple of the key questions, the process and the implementation. One of the biggest things that most people associate with Congress is writing legislation. That can be a very long process, a very detailed process, and very, very important to try to get it right. This could relate to both writing an entire bill, or it could relate to drafting an amendment. But again, these are the key questions, the process and the implementation to go through to make sure that the legislation is ready and eventually gets considered before a committee, and then potentially eventually the full House or Senate. So additionally to that, and very much related, is when members of Congress are asked to vote, they are required to go to the chamber, and the House and the Senate have slightly different approaches for that. But in many cases, the personal offices are preparing the members for those votes, that vote or series of votes. And so there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to look at the type of bill that's coming before, or the amendments that are a part of that. And these are the key questions and the process and the implementation steps in order to make sure the member is well informed and ready to take that vote. And then finally, I would say this has happened a little bit less during the pandemic period, but it was very common for members of Congress to speak before some group, whether that's in Washington or back in their state or home district. And these aren't speeches that just happen off the cuff. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, knowing who that person is speaking to, scheduling that event, and then preparing the speech itself and all the other information that goes with it, and including doing the media for that. So again, these were just 3 very real scenarios, and that these are some of the things that you may see as a part of your intern experience on what goes on behind the curtain. So a lot more to talk about there, but happy to be prepared, and thanks for the opportunity, and happy to take some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Franz and Nan, so much. I know we just covered a lot for everybody that's in the session. Like Franz said, I want to open it up for questions. So if anybody has any questions regarding the vast amount of information that we just covered, please feel free to drop it in the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to get some Q&A started on our end. So we went over how this isn't really like Schoolhouse Rock, like the video we all saw in grade school, middle school, and there's so much more that meets the eye. So I'm gonna start with you, Nan. What surprised you most when you started interning and working on the Hill?
One thing that surprises me most is how much you have to do for the members. There's so much going on, and on top of anything having to do with Congress, they're also fundraising. They're worrying about meeting with constituents when they're home. And especially as we went through Franz's presentation, I was just struck with like, oh my word, you have to do everything for them. And while they certainly provide, a guide in terms of ideology or values, messaging, a lot of things like that, some are more active in the process than others, but like usually a legislative director, just hands members a list and shoves them towards the floor and says, go vote, and here's how you're gonna vote on these things, because the staff are the ones who have done the deep dive and know where everything is. So yeah, you have to do everything for members.
Yeah, I can 100% echo some of those sentiments. That there's so much going on in one time, like you mentioned. There's votes, there's upcoming hearings, then you have virtual town halls or phone calls, and then there's the campaign side of everything, especially if you're in the House, which never ends. So having that support from staff is absolutely crucial, and definitely something that I also felt from day one. I agree. Franz, do you have any thoughts as well?
Sure, I'd say that one of the challenges is just sometimes how complex things can be. Even something that sounds like, oh, this is a simple letter, which was a reference before. There's many steps to that. So part of the experience which I hope you have is just kind of better understanding some of those steps that happen behind the scenes, the constituencies that are there, the lobbyists, other offices in your delegation. I mean, there's just so many sort of components to take into account when making a step or making a decision to go forward. So
yeah, that is absolutely true. We mentioned in all 3 of our presentations that in one format or another, in people's minds, everybody thinks, especially growing up or taking civics or history in high school, and that all 3 branches are equal in power and size and resources. But obviously we've kind of touched upon it, and Franz, I'd love to go to you on this. Can you kind of give a deeper dive into that imbalance of resources, size, and power between all 3 branches?
Sure. You had a very good graphic showing the funding for discretionary spending. Essentially, that's funding for most things that people think cover governing functions. And the one aspect for the legislative branch, which is less than 0.5%. And then on top of that, if you were to take the judicial branch of government, the 3rd branch, they are approximately the same size. So the judicial branch is slightly larger than the legislative branch in total funding and staffing. But the reality is that those 2 branches of government make up less than 1% of discretionary funding, and the executive branch makes up the other 99%. So there are many more resources, there are many more people, there are many more agencies than there are in terms of the resources for Congress. It is a real struggle for members of Congress through their personal offices, through the committees and other ways to keep track of that. It's a struggle to do oversight. It has become increasingly so with the a greater partisanship, but I just want to try to be very clear that, you know, it sounds good on paper that there's three co-equal branches of government, and that is how the Constitution laid it out. And they do have very similar checks and balances to each other. But the amount of resources, the number of staff is definitely not in the same balance. So that's most of what a lot of citizens don't know that.
I completely agree. Nan, do you have maybe a couple seconds thoughts on that?
Well, I was going to say one thing that struck me with the chart is how big the Department of Defense is. I love America. I think the Department of Defense is really important, but you often will hear, especially around appropriations, you know, defense versus non-defense spending. And, you know, that chart just shows like why that is a silly way, a silly framework for looking at all of our appropriations. Why is one agency have to, you know, be the same as this host of other agencies and this host of other spending, again, including the legislative branch and the judiciary? It's just such unhealthy framing in terms of good budgeting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, it's something I didn't realize until working on the Hill. And I hope that this information translates to everybody in this session, that you can kind of think about things in that context. So thank you so much to Nan and Franz for the presentations. I hope everybody in this session has found it insightful and informative. Like Nan said, we have resources available as well, so hopefully check those out. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.